Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, today's podcast will probably be one of several that resulted from a week-long collection of webinars that took place to commemorate 50 years since the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was called the Dr. King Jubilee Summit and took place March 23rd through April 5th of 2018. It was organized by two of the movement's foremost thinkers who are also doers. So let me introduce you to their work by reading a brief bio about each. Reverend Dr. Virgil A. Wood served with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a member of his National Executive Board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference for the last 10 years of Dr. King's life. Dr. Wood earned his Master of Divinity from Andover Newton Theological School in Newton, Massachusetts, and his doctorate in education from Harvard. He served as Dean and Director of the African American Institute, an Associate Professor at Virginia Seminary and College in Lynchburg, and as Visiting Lecturer, Research, and Teaching Fellow at Harvard University. Dr. Ralph P. Hall is an Associate Professor at Virginia Tech and has a Ph.D. in Technology, Management, and Policy from MIT with postdoctorate work at Stanford. He also holds master's degrees from MIT in Technology and Policy and Civil and Environmental Engineering, and one in Civil Engineering from University of Southampton. He coordinates sustainable development projects and serves on numerous boards, so we are blessed to have him working as a proponent for the Just Third Way project financing mechanisms. The first recording here is from a presentation by Dr. Norman Kurland called Economic and Social Justice for All in the Age of the Robot.
Good afternoon, my fellow citizens, neighbors, friends, and all. What a delight it is to be back with you on this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jubilee Summit. Today, we are privileged to have presenting Dr. Norman Kurland, who was a close confidant and co-worker with the late Louis O. Kelso. It was my desire 50 years ago to bring Kelso and King together. That never happened. But today, we're as close to that, I believe, as we've been before. Dr. Kurland will speak on economic and social justice for all in the age of the robot.
Thank you very much, Brother Virgil. We've been working for a long time together, and I remember when Kelso and I co-founded the Institute for the Study of Economic System. You are one of the founding board members, so I really appreciate, after all these years, that was back in 1968.
Okay, yes.
Okay, and so, and Kelso, as I have often said, was brought in an idea that I thought that Dr. King was looking for. As a matter of fact, Dr. King and I met back in June of 1963 when we were both going on an airplane down to Medgar Evers's funeral, and I was very close, as you know, to Medgar Evers back in my work in Mississippi.
Yes.
For the Civil Rights Commission. And I met with him, but that was before I knew of Kelso.
Mm-hmm.
So the story of what our group has been founded on was really, that is the Center for Economic and Social Justice, was to explain the breakthrough that Kelso added. And then also we're there trying to teach the principles of economic and social justice. And these are terms that I have to say that after graduating from law school at the University of Chicago, where I studied economics and law. They teach you economics up to a degree, although I think Kelso radically updated economic thinking. But in law, they teach you the law without teaching justice. So we formed in 1984 the Center for Economic and Social Justice. But just so that we all understand, this is an opportunity to deal with what's missing in academia. And so one of our major projects is the formation of a new university on the subject. It would be called not Freedom University or Liberty University, as conservatives have formed, but this would be a middle-of-the-road, just third way approach. We call it Justice University. And we have the University of Alberta in Canada are helping us to form that, in Webster University. But obviously, we'd like to have other universities. And that's very important, because I think what's missing is that people are not getting, at the highest level of education, they're not getting an understanding of justice. They don't talk about justice in such a way that you can see how to take the present world where people are divided, to bring them together. Now, that's where Dr. King was a person who, he said, I like this quote because I think that explains in a very profound way. This was back in 1967 in a speech, Where Do We Go From Here? He said, the Kingdom of Brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem is racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. And that's what Kelso added, because you could not deal with these issues until we deal with that realm of thinking we call economics, which is basically in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. These are the urgent needs. These are our animal needs. And if you don't satisfy the animal needs, the social needs, the political needs, and finally the need for every human being to reach a level of their fullest potential. And that's where if the educational system is missing on the urgent needs, the economic and survival needs, then we can never get the kind of world that Dr. King was talking about. Dr. King was also a leader in another way. I love this expression. He says we need leaders, not with love of money, but in love with justice, not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. And so the just third way, and I'll get into the specifics of what do we mean by that, by saying it will deal with justice, yes, it will deal with social justice, it will deal with economic, and define these terms. But one of the major advantages of Kelso, and I've talked, he and Mortimer Adler published a book with a title which you could understand because he was challenging Karl Marx. And in the Communist Manifesto, Marx said you can summarize our entire philosophy in a single sentence. Well, that's important. We want to look at that. And what did Marx say? Marx said, abolish something called private property. And this is an issue that most people don't, they think of private property of things, but they're not things. It's the rights and powers and privileges and even limitations on those powers. It's the right, so it's an empowerment issue. And it's also where you get the income to be able to consume. That is how do you relate that to the income that people have? And Kelso is pretty much saying that human beings have not changed from the time they stepped out of a cave and had very primitive tools to a time where there were maybe a couple thousand years ago, there may have been hundreds of thousands of people. But today, there's 7 billion now people. And then we look at what's the problem in economics? And it's a simple thing. It's who owns the new tools that enable the population to go from hundreds of thousands, thousands of years ago to now over 7 billion. Well, who owns the tools? What has changed in the tools? And we see it's the tools that have changed to enable the population to be what it is, despite the fact that we have incredible poverty throughout the world. And so Kelso saw this, and today you have robots coming into being and artificial intelligence in which the machines, the energy slave of artificial intelligence, are able to beat the top leaders, chess players and others. And then recently there was an article saying that 70 million workers in the next 30 years are going to be eliminated because of robotics. You have robots that can produce robots. What was wrong with what Marx said? Well, because Marx did not recognize ownership of those tools, of the robots. Who will own the robots? And Kelso said everyone will be able to own the tools that displace human labor so that we can have another goal in terms of people's work. It doesn't have to be economic work. It can be what Aristotle called the work of civilization. He called it leisure work, the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of work that Ralph is doing, and the kind of work that people would do. That is, your teaching is terribly important. Can you imagine that if people got their income from capital, sufficient income, they would go into teaching if they're genuine teachers, and that would mean education would be available free or limited costs. The same thing with health. We look for health. And yet, if doctors, politics, if politicians went as the America's founders did and got their income from ownership of capital, they'd be less susceptible to being bribed and corrupted. Who owns those, the modern tools of the world? And you finally look and you see 1/10 of 1% of Americans own more than the bottom 90% combined. And obviously the bottom 50% have virtually no ownership at all. But if you owned, your rights of private property, that is, private property, would be accessible. And remember that the founders of this country said that they wouldn't even get the right to vote. And of course we had the sin of slavery, and it was the worst form of slavery in the history because they didn't treat people as being human. Or they were only 3/5 of a human being. You see, all these things come, we can look at the past, we can see the good in the past, and we can see what went wrong in the past. So let me now talk about what did Kelso, how do we explain what Kelso did, and then let me say that I also want to talk about Buckminster Fuller because he was probably the most important designer of the physical system. He understood the power of technology. Bucky for example, I have to quote from him because I think that's what the Just Third Way is trying to do. He says, we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. Our challenge is to make the world work for not 50%, for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Now, that to me is a beautiful expression. Of course, I worked, as you know, with Fuller, or I was trying to get him into Harlem back right after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and you had I was called in by the Central Harlem Council and Neighborhood Boards and had one of the great leaders that I've met in my life, a woman, Ennis Francis, and who you knew. But she died in 1980, so even though we ran her for vice president in the New Hampshire primaries, she died that year. Okay, she was tremendous. And then, of course, there are very few leaders. See, I look for leaders like Wyvetter Young in East St. Louis, and we're trying to build a new city there. And just as Bucky agreed, he had a plan for Harlem, but we couldn't raise the money. Then in 98, Dawn, and my daughter Dawn, who's our director of communications, went there with her husband, and we met Wyvetter Young, another great leader. And what were they trying to do? To build a new city in East St. Louis called Old Man River City. Bucky Fuller had designed it in the 70s. You see, and again, she died before we had everything put together and so on. It's a great story. But in the event, let me now turn to what those leaders of the future and the young people, that what they understood was that if the leaders in politics and the leaders on Wall Street don't buy into ideas that are just, then you have to engage in what the civil rights movement taught us. People power. What Martin Luther King taught. Peaceful people power. And it was effective. I had worked with SNCC and Medgar and Aaron Henry in Mississippi. The SNCC had Bob Moses, another great leader, because they had the guts to go forward. And while Mississippi seemed to be impossible to change, well, when I first got there in 62, by 64, what they did was have a Mississippi Freedom Summer, and they brought students into Mississippi. And as a result, and of course, Martin Luther King's initiatives, you had the Civil Rights Act of 64. No one would believe that and say that you could accomplish it. But what was it? People power. And that's what we have to teach. That's what true teachers with guts, willingness to give their lives if necessary for justice for all. In any event, let's now talk about justice as a, what do we mean by that? It has to be based, the concept of justice is based on the dignity and empowerment of every person. It starts with each of us must be given the dignity of being in a just society. And our institutions are the key. And the institutions are tools. The state is a tool. The family is a tool. The religious organizations are tools. The money system, money itself is a tool. These are social tools. You see, they're not people, but they are invented not by God, but by people. The one thing we have to understand in trying to change the system is that you can't expect anything that human beings, only the Creator understands perfect truth, perfect justice. The Creator didn't create the state, it were people. And the one thing you know is our people are imperfect and our institutions are imperfect. And the important thing is the dignity and empowerment of every person is the basis of one of the first principles of understanding justice and economic justice. And this is where I look at it in terms of four different pillars of change. The first being the human being, every human being, and the importance. The second is what Kelso added, and that was what he called the binary economic system. And this is where Marx was wrong. This is where Keynes was wrong. This is where Milton Friedman is wrong, because they thought they did not understand that they believed in what's called the productivity of labor as the way of measuring progress, never talking about ownership. The very concept in economics of labor productivity, saying that the workers were increasing their production. No, they weren't increasing their production. It were the tools. So therefore, Kelso started with the restoration of something that Marx and Keynes rejected. And that was Say's law of markets. And Kelso said it will work because there are only two sides to the economic equation. One is production and the other is consumption, or in economic terms, it's aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So we have to see that labor contributes, true, and it should get valued on the basis of the market value of labor. And the same thing, if capital is now producing more and more and more of the wealth together with people, then the incomes from the contribution an owner makes have to be equal to the capital incomes. And of course, you see that those who have the billionaires own most of the capital assets, things, and that is productive things, and therefore that's okay. We don't have to take that property away from them. We can have a tax system that taxes them, but in the meantime also a tax, and most important, I'll talk about the monetary system. Kelso's in his second book, which was called The New Capitalists, but it was, the subtitle tells you what it was all about. It was a proposal to free economic growth from the slavery of past savings. You see, and incidentally, these books are available. Kelso's writings and our books are available at our website, www.cesj.org. And you go there and you'll get the books, you'll get videos of Kelso on 60 Minutes, where he did a superb job. But because I think Kelso is important, I want to talk about him. And what did he, when we formed the center, the Institute, I was also his Washington counsel, and we were able to find a leader, which is very unusual. One of the most powerful people in Washington, the son of Huey Long, who was assassinated because he was a threat to, I don't know, I don't want to say that this was in 1936, he had formed clubs, Huey Long, clubs called Share the Wealth Clubs. But that was taking from the rich, and it was unnecessary. Kelso understood, and Russell Long was a believer in private property. And Kelso and I met with him in 1973, and he paid for the dinner in one of the most expensive restaurants in Washington. And he listened for over 3 hours. And the next day we started getting legislation. And he felt that the employee stock ownership plan, which was one tool that Kelso developed, he was the founder. He was the artist who put it together many years before I even knew of his ideas. I didn't know of his ideas until after I quit the government. And then somebody introduced me to Kelso's ideas. But anyway, so we got an employee stock ownership plan, and now I think it's something over 10 million workers have become owners, and they don't put up their own money. Why? Because Kelso in the second book said what you do is use credit, and credit is only promises. Money ultimately is supposed to be backed by assets. Kelso said the present monetary system has no assets. It's backed by government debt. So the more we go into deficits, it means that that's what it's backing the money. The Federal Reserve does that. So in the reforms to the money and the growth of capital, you must democratize access to insured capital credit. And so any individual can become an owner. So we can change the laws. We can change Federal Reserve policy. As a matter of fact, we don't even have to change the Federal Reserve Act because they gave the authorization for the democratization of new money so that local banks or cooperative banks could make loans so that every individual would get, like you get the right to the vote, but more important is the right to the economic power behind the vote. Through the Kelso theory, you can do that. And then we talk about the binary economics are two. Then we talk about the number 3 pillar of the just third way is what we call economic justice. What is economic justice? Well, in the first book with Adler, Kelso pointed out that you must have equality of participation, and that means equality not only to contribute your labor to the extent economic labor is necessary, but you also, if everybody owned and were able to own, have equal opportunity to become owners, they would be contributing their capital assets. And so on the other side of participation, how are you going to measure what they get out? Well, Kelso said the market system is the most democratic way of determining value, if it's not a monopolistic one, as capitalism is. You see? So therefore, we need a system. A lot of people talk about distributive justice, but what they mean is you distribute according to need. That's fine as a principle for charity, yes, but it's not for justice. And charity should never be a substitute for justice. As a matter of fact, charity is the soul of justice, but it should never be a substitute for justice. So in justice, it's the market system that would be used so that fewer and fewer people need charity. But it's there. It must be as a backup. So I'm not, Kelso was not against the use of welfare as a temporary expedient. So you could redistribute through government. That's fine to meet their needs in the beginning. And we come and advocate ways of doing that. So we have a whole legal system that we'll get into called the Capital Homestead Act. So in any event, if you have balance between participation and participative justice and distributive justice, that's fine. Everything will work beautifully. But you don't have that. Anything human beings design will always be imperfect. So what do you do when a system is imperfect and unjust, such as the concept of segregation was unjust? How was that changed? Well, it changed because, and I learned this from one of our co-founders, Father William Ferree, very critical, because I didn't understand what social justice is until I learned it from Ferree, who was one of our co-founders, and he was the head of Dayton University and other universities, the Marionist order. And he's recognized around the world for his writing on social justice. And what was it? What is social justice? Well, that is, if you think of a system, it's got to be, you have feedback. You understand that there's imperfection in the system. What do? People power. Organize, just as Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and you could see the same thing happened in South Africa. It was peaceful people power. Same thing in Poland with the Solidarity Union. And so that was very, very important. Now we'll get to the fourth. These are the 4 pillars: expanded capital ownership, So that's very basic. That's what's missing. The other three, limited economic power of the state. So you shift from state ownership and control of production and income distribution to the citizens. You limit the government's power over the economy. How? By putting economic power in the people. And so the founders were right that the state should not have concentrated economic power. Marx was wrong. Kelso was right. You democratize ownership. And that's where the third pillar is private property. And most people don't understand what private property is. And I hope that people now see that it will empower the person who owns both his body. In other words, what was slavery? The slave did not own his own property. So control over the person and everything about the person and control over what they produce as workers were owned by the owner. Well, that was wrong. You see, it was unjust, and therefore we've gotten away to some extent from that, although we do have much racism. And then the fourth pillar is the free and open market for restoring free and open markets. This would gradually eliminate all the non-voluntary methods of determining prices, wages, and profits. This will decentralize, not concentrate economic choice. It would empower every person as a consumer, a worker, and an owner. So those are the four pillars of the just third way. All of them are important. Economic justice is important. And as you now see that, I hope you see that we should begin teaching what social justice really is. And that is, you're going to have to, if you see a way that any system, any institution, whether it's your family, whether it's the state, whether it's your religion, they'll all be imperfect. So what do you do if you see that and have a way of making it more perfect? Well, the one thing you should always understand, you can't change it by yourself. You must get others, and you must combine to the level of people power that will change the system and can change the world. You see, the ideas we're talking about are universal. And now let's talk about capital homesteading. Well, that's the law that we've developed that would change the Federal Reserve so that it would begin to democratize the money system so that banks, the local banks, would be able to make loans to people as they do with ESOPs. And we've done ESOPs. We've done the first 100% leveraged buyouts of companies by the workers through the ESOP that Kelso invented and we worked on. And as a matter of fact, I had a hand in writing the first ESOP laws, Russell Long, and we did one. It was basically what turned into Conrail when Penn Central went into collapse. This is before we met with Russell Long, we had some bipartisan support for turning that new system, which became Conrail, into a 100% employee-owned company through an ESOP, and that was the first initiative that Russell Long took. When we finished the meeting, he listened to Kelso. I just sat there listening to the two making exchanges. And finally, Russell Long said, and this is how you deal with real leaders. He said, okay, I understand. Who's against this? He first asked. We said, well, you got two Nobel Prize winning economists, Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson at MIT. They both won Nobel Prizes. He said, okay. He said, well, let me tell you that when I first came into Congress, into the Senate, when my father was assassinated, I was elected to replace him. I said to myself, I'm going to try to follow this principle. I really don't care who's right. I care what's right. And he says, now, what are you people doing about it? See, Kelso never mentioned what we had done in organizing the people to turn the Penn Central into Conrail. And so he said, you bring me something tomorrow morning. And the next day, we started getting the first law. And had Russell Long not become the champion, about 6 months later, or 5 months later, it was in April of 74, the ESOP law was passed. Despite the opposition, Russell Long was powerful enough to get it in. There have been about 25 laws now, and they've improved the ESOP in many respects. So the ESOP exists now. You could have what we were trying to do in Harlem and East St. Louis was to turn all the citizens into the owners of the land for what we now call the Citizens Land Development Co-ops. Wybetta Young wanted to call it that, or a Citizen Land Bank, you could call it. And that way, we got a law passed through the Illinois House of Representatives in order to do this, where every man, woman, and child who had a permanent residence there would automatically become the owner of the land that was formerly owned by the city or the state. And that way they could develop. And we also had NASA power technology people ready to bring one of the most advanced energy system. They had to clean up the brownfields, etc. And it was about a $60 million project. We went to the Federal Reserve, the St. Louis Fed, and they were very open. We got a terrific article on our work. Bucky had passed away, but we worked with his partners. And then Dean Price at Georgetown University was a master architect there. And then, of course, the people in NASA, the power technology. And it would have been an advanced approach to producing high-powered, very fine energy. Then we have another thing that could happen is, and this is really, I think, the real key, is to set up an account for every child, every woman, every man, so that in the future, as the economy is going to grow, or the existing owners want to sell their shares, they would be able to buy it by going to the local bank. Every citizen we divided the new capital formation of a couple $1 trillion into by the population of the United States. It came to about 7,000 per man, woman, and child. If a child born today, by the time they'd reach age 65, they'd have close to $500,000 in assets. They get close to 50,000 a year in dividends. You wouldn't need Social Security. And this is important also because one of the things that's bankrupting one city after the other, for example, we're working now with people in Wayne County, Michigan, and Detroit, they're very interested in the concept, and we're saying you want to let's get us to the Fed, use the power, because you're bankrupt because of the cost of pensions and pension costs and rising teacher costs and government workers. Well, if they were able to accumulate their assets without having to pay, without having to save, because they can't afford to save, therefore the capital homestead account would be a vehicle in which they get, say, 7,000 a year. It could be, actually, we could grow the economy faster. It could be 14,000 a year if you doubled the growth rates. You see, in other words, the need for new capital. Don't worry about the robots. Don't worry about the robots. If you own the robots, you'd have a source of income, because there's no way of stopping technological advance. And it makes no sense. Grow the economy in ways that produce justice, economic justice for every person. So the Capital Homestead Act would provide that source of capital, that source of money. That it's currency. No, it isn't. But Kelso defined money in a beautiful way. Money is not a part of the visible sector of the economy. People do not consume money. Money is not a physical factor of production, but rather a yardstick for measuring economic input, economic outtake, and the relative values of the real goods and services of the economic world. Money provides a method of measuring obligations, rights, powers, and privileges. It provides a means whereby certain individuals can accumulate claims against others or against the economy as a whole or against many economies. It's a system of symbols that many economists substitute for the visible sector and its productive enterprises, goods and services, thereby losing sight of the fact that a monetary system is a part only of the invisible sector of the economy, and that its adequacy can only be measured by its effect on the visible sector. Now, I think once we understand that money is only a social tool, it can be changed. Let's start, because I think it's very important for us to begin to study what Kelso had to say, what CESJ has to say about money. And this is just creating money for capital homesteading. Your corporations, for example, to grow, they're going to have to issue shares. Okay, but they want cash because they want to add the new capital tools, land, structures, robots, whatever it is. And so what do? Well, they're going to sell the stock to the individuals, but then where's the money going to come from? And that's where the commercial lender, whether it's your local banks, come, and they look at they get a guarantee from the corporation that they will pay out their profits fully in order to pay off the loan. The citizen at the bank says, I want to get a loan from you. And so they make out a note, and the commercial bank satisfies that. But then one of the things that people say is, well, a bank doesn't make a loan unless there's collateral behind it. So this is one of the reasons that the rich get richer and people without savings can't get rich. So what's Kelso's answer? Capital credit insurance. Now that, it's so brilliant, because then the risk may be 0.5% or 1%, but it's a substitute for the demand that capital be there. And then you take all these notes from all the people wanting to buy shares in company ABC, and what does it do? Well, they bundle those notes and take it to the discount, or it's called the rediscount window of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve creates money, new money. And they take a service fee, just as the bank would get a service, but it'd be interest-free money. That's very important to understand. Interest is only there on money when you've accumulated and you lend it out to someone else. But again, I think people should go to our website and go to the books and articles, and they'll get more detail on that. One of the things we want to make sure that management hasn't all the power, or the present owners can control everything. No. What we would do is make it possible for the corporation to escape from paying corporate taxes if they pay out all their profits, so that all their profits get subject to being taxed at the personal level. So the rich will get a lot of personal income, high personal income, but it won't be if they pay out their profits instead of storing it in the corporation in order to concentrate ownership even more. So if they do that, if they don't pay out their profits, there'll be a corporation tax. If they do, it will enable all citizens to become owners and pay for the loan out of future savings. That's a major breakthrough. It works. We're proving it with ESOPs. We can, and what happens with ESOPs, it can work even better if it's done as a universal and basic human right. Now, the UN's universal set of human rights, Article 17, says that every person should be an owner, and no country in the world yet is doing that. And it doesn't matter if the U.S. is not going to do it. We're out there encouraging. I was encouraging this in Russia back in 1990, and I was invited by a communist, and he loved it, and he actually gave me a letter saying that I would represent them before all these the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc. So this is, in a summary, I think what we're talking about would change the world. We're going to teach it. We already have it organized to teach, and we can do it even free. And it can be downloaded and done on a global basis until we get other universities, enough universities to get behind Justice University. They can all be affiliated with it, and they begin teaching economic justice and social justice, and we can have a more ideal global economy. Thank you.
Dr. Norman Kurland, this was absolutely stunning, and thank you. I think now to give you a chance to catch your breath a little, and people kind of get their thoughts together. Some will want to raise some questions, and as they get those together, I would like to raise one myself to start with. And it is that extraordinary insight on Buckminster Fuller. It seems to me that his mission there for Space Earth is something that every institution could identify, could embrace as part of their own mission,
Exactly.
Local and global, because in a sense, America now has become the world in local communities. From all over the world we have come, and the only way now that we can expect to have a world that's going to work is that we are guided by a North Star like that. What do you say to that?
Absolutely. I love what Fuller said. As a matter of fact, you know what he said was the backing for money?
Is that?
It's the kilowatt hour.
Huh.
You see, Bucky was pushing for a grid that would create money, and it could be done without the fossil fuels. So it would be done because you could now transmit 1,500 miles rather than a couple hundred miles.
Yes.
And you could link up all the continents. And everyone, the poorest country would have this available, but they could also, to the extent, I happen to believe that there's a need to move to a global monetary system available as a fundamental human right. And so the Kelso, Adler, Fuller, and Ferree, and obviously Dr. King. You see, those were people in the 20th century. Now we need equivalent leaders for the 21st century to be able to carry this message. And it won't be me. You know, I was only a year. Let's see. Dr. King was about a year and 3 months older than I am. So you better get some new people, particularly the young people. I'm really counting on them. I love what they did in terms of dealing with regulating guns. They didn't say abolish. And if it's done right, if we think about it, what's the purpose of government? You know, if you go to the preamble of the Constitution, it doesn't say we, the government, created the people. It says we, the people. In order to form a more perfect union, what's the next two words? Establish what? Establish justice. And so America can still lead the world if we have leaders who will be willing to bring justice to every member of American society from the bottom up. You see, we don't have to take away, by the way, we don't have to take away the property of the rich because they can't figure out how to take it when they die. So in the Capital Homestead Act, we would not tax the estate. We would give the rich the opportunity to spread it out to all the workers who helped create their fortune, to the teachers, to politicians. So that's a very, and tax them if they have, let's say, over $1 million or $2 million, because $1 million or $2 million will keep you in pretty good shape if you get the earnings from $1 million or $2 million. And then everything above that would be taxed, so that the rich would be encouraged to spread it out to people. You could say, oh, they can do it to foundations, but even foundations are not promoting justice at this time. Sure. So the more important thing is to get it to the people.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norm. Let's see now. Those who are online here who may well have some questions or comments, this is your time.
Hi, Norm. It's Ralph Hall here at Virginia Tech. I have a question about the four accounts or mechanisms. You talked about ESOPs, which are targeting workers. You've got the Capital Homestead account, which is focused on citizens.
Right.
You've got the Citizens Land Bank, which is for residents, and then the Consumer Stock Ownership Plan for utility customers. And I'm sort of wondering, when I've talked to people about these ideas, and related to binary economics, at some point the first response you get is, what is the sort of empirical impact? Where's the evidence? What they want to sort of see numbers and dig into what is the sort of impact of this. And I'm wondering what your sense of this is. How do you respond to those kinds of questions, and have you run sort of the numbers, or is that something you recommend?
No, I haven't run the numbers. I've said the ESOP exists, so no one can check it and see that it isn't working. There are some that are not working well because they don't have justice-based management. I didn't get into that enough, but because we would have a corporation, for example. Let's start with the corporation, and that is the governance would be 1/3 of the board would be the management representatives. 1/3 of the board would be the non-management, and the other third would be outsiders, and it could be outside shareholders. You see, so that you have a way in which the justice can be maintained in the corporation. And now, so outside of the ESOPs, you're going to need laws changed, similar to what we were able to do in East St. Louis. It was the only place. I'm encouraging that for Wayne County, Detroit and Wayne County, because they're one of the poorer. They're truly a troubled city, and so I'm encouraging that. But we got it passed in Illinois unanimously, 114-0. But when she died, we didn't have anybody in the Senate who were ready to take it on. But 114-0. Well, the same thing can be done for Wayne County, Illinois, to become a model. That's what we're proposing. We also proposed it for a couple other places. Hartford, Connecticut is virtually bankrupt because of their pension problems. And cities throughout the country cannot handle the need because they don't know where the tax money is going to come to afford the pensions. Well, I say the sooner we move in and enable people to get at least $7,000 a year to buy to and every worker would have, every member of their family, their wives and children would have access to the same amount. So that here's another point that I think I have to make, Ralph. Well, in companies that pay out, that is ESOP companies, particularly 100% ESOPs, but ESOP companies where not only do the workers benefit from being able to acquire shares on credit through future profits, but also additional profits will go as a way of increasing their incomes. And this is very important. I used to work, when I left the federal government, I worked for a group called the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty. I was their director of planning. And it was headed by Walter Reuther of the UAW. And Reuther said, I brought Kelso in to give a talk on his ideas. You had about 1,000 people in the room. And the liberals were against Kelso's ideas in general. But we got grassroots people, and they voted for Kelso's plan for our group to study his ideas, despite the fact that many of the leaders, they're against it. Well, Reuther must have picked up on this and liked it, because he testified before the Joint Economic Committee of Congress in 1967 that he died in an airplane crash soon, not too long after that. But anyway, his testimony, I could read it to you because I think it's very important. We would have avoided the Rust Belt in America. Reuther said, profit sharing in the form of stock distribution to workers would help to democratize the ownership of America's vast corporate wealth, which today is appallingly undemocratic and unhealthy. Profit sharing in a form that would help to correct the shocking maldistribution would be highly desirable for that reason alone. And then he said, if workers had definite assurance of equitable shares in the profits of the corporation that employ them, they would see less need to seek an equitable balance between their gains and soaring profits through augmented increases in basic wage rates. This would be a desirable result from the standpoint of stabilization policy because profit sharing does not increase costs, since profits are a residual after all costs have been met, and since their size is not determinable until after customers have paid the prices charged for the firm's products. Profit sharing as such cannot be said to have an inflationary impact upon costs. And so this, to me, this was a realist now. Had the UAW adopted that in all, well, you had 30% of the workforce were in unions. Today it's about 6%. And the growth of unionization is in the public sector. So I think that we would not have had, well, just think of it. When I was a kid, the hourly wage rates was 25 cents an hour. Okay? And it got to be about 40 cents during the Second World War. And during the war, while you had enormous unemployment before the war, they took 13 million of the most able-bodied workers and put them into the war to fight the war. And you had growth rates not of 1% or 2%, they had double-digit rates of growth. Why? Because there were customers. Who was the customer? The government would buy all the weapons necessary to fight the war. So see, this is another point to be made. We would not have had the Rust Belt. You wouldn't be demanding $15 an hour. What's that going to do to America's ability to export? Become a net exporter rather than a net importer? You see? And not only that, I'm confident. At one point, I was invited to China, and they sent some people around. I brought them to some of the better ESOP companies around, and so they they decided that they invited me. But then when Tiananmen Square occurred, I said that, I was not about to go to China at that time. But my sense is this: if China takes these ideas before the United States, great, because that's going to have an impact in politics, and you're going to have greater freedom if they take our ideas. So, I'm answering you, Ralph, in a broader way to say I'm not worried about the other three techniques, even the ESOPs, if you have if you have the capital homestead account for every citizen.
Great, thank you. There were two questions here which have been sort of submitted by attendees, so I'll read them out. I think the first one could be answered by both you and Dr. Wood. So here's the question. What was Louis Kelso's position on MLK's civil rights strategies?
I think he was generally positive. Let me say this. I think that Kelso, in terms of economic justice, was very sound. But I don't think that he was like Father Ferry in terms of social justice. I don't want to be critical of him. As I say, he was my most important teacher. But he was not an aggressive. He certainly was open to having civil rights leaders like Dr. Wood. We had the head of corps. No, the head of corps. I'm trying to remember. Well, anyway, he and the guy who was the head then. They had Soul City. He was prepared. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're talking about Floyd McKissick was then the head of court, and Kelso and he worked together in order to make it a community that would be owned by the people. So I guess he was open. He was open, but he was not aggressive. Let's see. Ennis Francis was on the board. I met with A. Philip Randolph and as I say, with Medgar. So he knew what I was doing. But Virgil, why don't you give your own thoughts of Kelso?
Martin never confronted the question, so we don't know what. I think what was going on at the end, when he was getting rid of the Poor People's Campaign, mm-hmm. I had worked with Martin at the same time, worked with Leon Sullivan in his OIC movement. And Sullivan was leading us into the economic area in a very effective way. Mm-hmm. And Martin had brought 1,200 urban pastors to North Miami for preparation for the Poor People's Campaign. Somehow I got Thursday night for the keynote address. My speech was essentially on the value of going to Wall Street with a Kelso agenda rather than to Washington with an agenda to extend the welfare state. Mm-hmm. And Martin said to me that night after it was over, okay, I'll never forget it. He was run down, tired. He put his hand on my shoulder and said to me, he said, you're right. This is what we ought to be doing. But we can't do that now. I think what he was saying was he does not have time to make that switch. He knew then that the guns were trained on him, and he realized that he could be taken away almost any time. I believe had he taken that sabbatical in '66 that he wanted to take, I would predict that Martin Luther King and Louis Kelso would have gotten together somewhere in that sabbatical, which he did not take, sadly.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I didn't realize that, but that's good news.
You had another question, Ralph? Or you
Yeah, the second question that was submitted here relates to the work of Buckminster Fuller, and the question is really which of his writings are really valuable to us right now at this current time.
Well, Utopia or Oblivion and Critical Path, I think are very basic, very good. The quotes I take were from both documents on Fuller, but the important thing is anyway. I remember when I was called in to speak before the Central Harlem Council and Neighborhood Boards, and I had leaders there, both the president and then Ennis Francis was the head of the economics program. I wrote to Fuller and said, would you be interested? That Kelso was going to be, had come in. I got Kelso to give a talk in Harlem. And Fuller sends me an article that he had published in Esquire magazine on rebuilding Harlem, and pictures and all. So he had a vision. But as I say, while the Ford Foundation was supporting the Central Harlem Council with money, when it came to the economics, they did nothing. But in any event, yeah, this is what we have to do. If we can get enough thinkers in America, academics in America, to begin discussing these ideas, the principles are so simple and so morally sound that I don't know who could argue against it. You see, as I say, I've been able to talk to libertarians and communists and Stokely Carmichael. I give you the story of Stokely Carmichael. This is interesting. And that is, Stokely, when I was still working for the Citizens Crusade, Stokely and I brought Stokely in because we were going to get money from the Ford Foundation to train 500 workers. And I thought I was going to head the program and spread the ideas of Kelso throughout the country. But anyway, I wanted Stokely. I asked him if he would participate in it, and he said yes. And we met in New York. Ivanhoe Donaldson, who you probably know, Virgil, who worked for Marion Barry and so on. But anyway, Ivanhoe was in the meeting, and we were just having lunch, and I started explaining to Stokely Kelso's ideas. And I knew Stokely was a communist. I knew that. It doesn't bother me, So I made my presentation to him over lunch, and I said, do you have any problems with it? He said, well, no, I don't have problems with it, but they'll never buy it. And I said, Stokely, how can you say that? No revolutionary should ever say that if they could bring justice. I said, you're speaking to 99% of the world at least. How can you not? In any event, so Stokely, I think, blew it. And we need leaders who, if they hear something that's right, or if they think there's something wrong, they should raise the question and have it posed and answered. And that's a talk. That's a point that we're going to need, because I consider this a positive revolution. It's a revolution of ideas. No one need be hurt. No one need be damaged by the just third way revolution.
His impact on the way we think about human relations, the tensility impact with Stafford Beer, and the work that group has done, Team Integrity up there in Montreal, has done based on Bucky's work. Incidentally, we have proposed an initiative after school system for those communities that are at risk. In the memory of Bucky Fuller, the great thinker, scientist, etc., and Marian Anderson, the great diva in the African American pantheon of great artists, Anderson Fuller. And when you bring those kinds of dynamics together, I think you set humanity up to allow the revolution to take place on its own. We don't make revolution. Nobody wrote a script for Rosa Parks to go and do what she did, and for that community to do what they did. There was no script for that.
Right.
They improvised as they went along, and there were certain principles at work. I think in what we do here, there are individuals who sort of help set the atmosphere, the mindset, the collective wisdom out of which we make our decisions. And one of the things that I'm really like so much about a foreword that Wyatt Walker wrote to my book, In Love with Trust, he talked about how I had delved into King's personhood. And he said that we must not get hung up on so much about what he did as to who he was, because we act out of who we are. And there's no script for that. We come to a fork in the road, and based on who we are, we take the right turn. It's as though there were an invisible compass or something that we're responding to. And the result was that these are the people who helped turn America around in a new direction, interestingly, that we are yet to take. And this discussion today, I think, helps us to determine which fork in the road shall we take. Are there any more questions, Ralph?
I have one final question myself. I don't see any more questions being written in at this point. My question is a similar question to when I asked Robert Ashford, and that it relates to sort of the environmental impact of sort of future growth that could be enabled by increasing the effective demand or purchasing power of citizens. And so, Norm, what is your sort of approach to the environmental impact dimensions?
I love your question because I should have dealt with that. And that is, I think we have to stop. In 1960, a book was written, The Next 100 Years, by 3 professors at California Institute of Technology. And in that, they said, why are we using the fossil fuels? This is 1960. They were saying it took hundreds of millions of years to put it into the ground and keep it there as a safety cushion while developing the new energy technologies. And particularly now, I read about what's available in terms of advanced solar energy technologies. You see the price keep coming down and down. Well, I think we could not only stop climate change. And there may be some dispute about that, but in any event, again, these professors were right. We have to finance those green technologies. And I think that the way I look at it is the equivalent of what Truman did in winning. No, not Truman. It was Roosevelt did in figuring out how to win the war against the Nazis when they knew that the German scientists were developing atomic weapons. Were trying to develop them, and so they had what was called the Manhattan Project. Well, we need a new Manhattan Project that would be a worthwhile thing for government and foundations to get behind, to bring together the top scientists that they can and engineers together in teams. And so we were able to develop the atomic bomb. Okay, it was destructive. But had we not done that, I think, because I was stationed when I was in the, during the Korean War, I was in before, while the Korean War was in, but after the Korean War, I got stationed in Japan in an area where my translator was a former kamikaze pilot. And I know that Americans would have lost at least another 1 million troops. And and the Japanese would have suffered. So the use of the atomic bomb, I think, and my wife, as you know, is Japanese. She agrees with me that we had to get rid of the fascistic type of government in Japan, and that this would make sense. And so I would say that if we have, certainly Virginia Tech would be a great place, and MIT, and then Carnegie Mellon. Yeah, we just received something from Carnegie. What's his name, Dawn? But anyway, this fellow who, what was the name of the?
What's Wayne Trossel?
Who?
Wayne Trossel.
No. I'm talking about the professor.
Raj Reddy.
Raj Reddy. You see, one of the giants in America on this for many years of developing new energy systems. So we have to. It seems to me that if Virginia Tech and other universities, high tech, Caltech, etc., and from all over the world, just put in the money and get the price of energy down through green technologies. And I use what more than taking the hydrogen out of the solar energy, and that becomes a source, a cheap source. And if that's also, in a sense, this is what Bucky was talking about, that we can really solve the problem of global poverty. But we haven't. Bucky thought it was all going to be done, during his life. Well, it hasn't, but I think this is where academic leadership should be focused. It just is common sense. But I don't see it happening yet.
I just finished reading a book, Norm, that you could have written. It's called The Donut Economics. And I want to suggest that there are some suggestions in there that are going to be part of our ongoing conversation going forward. And it's premised around the notion that growth can be sustained indefinitely without certain other caveats with it. And that may well become part of our conversation as we go forward.
I love it. I love hearing about that.
Yes.
Virgil, I think we're not alone. There are people around the world who are seeking new solutions.
Absolutely.
And it's the system. It's the economic system that has to be adjusted. And as I say, that's the lowest order of human needs. So therefore, it's time for academia to wake up to the just third way and make it just have courses in it. And this is what we've already developed the idea of Justice University. And so if we work together, a number of universities, leading universities, it's going to happen. They can't ignore it. Even no matter what we think of the lack of political leadership in America, and I really think it's a dangerous leadership. But again, as far as I'm concerned, if academia wakes up and wakes up the media and wakes up intellectual and wakes up the students and high school students, and begin, see, we need if we get it at the highest level, the just third way being accepted by some leaders. There were some academics who I think years ago they passed on, but who would have been the former head of the University of Chicago he would have loved this idea. As a matter of fact, Mortimer Adler, who was the co-author of Kelso's first book, The Capitalist Manifesto, used to teach the philosophy of law at the University of Chicago before I got there. You see, and he had to reverse himself from support of socialism to Kelso's ideas. If you read the first book, The Capitalist Manifesto, you'll see two things. You read the preface was all written by Adler, and he said he gave Kelso all the credit. And then, however, in the chapter 5 on economic justice and economic rights, I'm sure that it's probably more Adler than Kelso. Okay?
Yeah. Norman, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you and say that we certainly look forward to the continuing dialogue and, but even more than that, putting our hands to the plow.
There you go, man.
Going forward.
I'm with you.
All right, buddy. Be well, man. Thank you.
Thank you very much for arranging this.
Indeed.
I wouldn't have the opportunity to communicate
That's right.
in this way.
Yeah.
And I do think that there is a leader in the world, and I'm hoping, and that's the Pope. And let me just see, the reason I think he's going to be, he would welcome this, and because the Catholic encyclicals are very good on social justice.
Right.
They have no encyclical on economic justice. And Kelso and Adler have added there. And Adler, of course, was a Thomist, Aristotelian Thomist scholar. So they should respect him. But Pope Francis, this is just beautiful. I'd like to just add this to a presentation. Here it is. This is in his. It was a letter that he developed called Evangelii Gaudium, but he talked about some challenges of today's world, and he said, in our time, humanity is experiencing a turning point in history. And then he had a couple of points that he had to make. He said, no to an economy of exclusion. He said the masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Say no to an economy of exclusion. Masses of people find themselves, oh no, I got that one. No to the new idolatry of money. He says, financial crisis can make us overlook the fact that it originated in a profound human crisis, the denial of the primacy of the human person. We have created new idols, the worship of the ancient golden calf. As we turn to a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. He says, say no to a financial system which rules rather than serves. And then he says, say no to the inequality that spawns violence. Until exclusion and inequality in society and between people are reversed, it will be impossible to eliminate violence. The poor and the poorer people are accused of violence, yet without equal opportunities, the different forms of aggression and conflict will find a fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. The conditions for a sustainable and peaceful development have not yet been adequately articulated and realized.
Wow.
Ready.
Wow. We will say to that, hallelujah. And the Pope says no to the golden calf.